and welcome to PEP Talk, the Persuasive Evangelism podcast. And my name is Christy Mayer and I'm one of the co-hosts for this podcast. And I'm joined today by the lovely Simon. Simon, hello, how are you doing?
Thank you very much. Yeah, very well, thank you. And thank you for calling me lovely. That's very, very
you are
kind.
Lovely. It's been great co-hosting some of these episodes with you in lieu of the banister. So it's great to have you here again, Simon.
Yes. And Andy is returning actually next week, so we'll see a lot more of him. So he'll be around a bit more soon. So.
Oh, yeah, I saw on Facebook that he landed to a littered airport terminal and felt greatly discouraged by it. So hopefully his experience will just go up from there. But speaking of kind of different experiences, we are joined today by Becci Greenfield, who works for Christian Vision. I believe, Becci, you've been in charge of kind of creating some of the content for Christian Vision. And you are also involved, you have lots of different roles. You're also involved in finance. You serve through a local church, doing all sorts of things. But one of the main areas in which you work is through helping others ask questions and think about how to best respond to those questions. Is that right? Is that a good summary of where you're at?
Yeah, it's hard to find a way to summarize, I guess, because I do so many random different things. But my main, 9 to 5 is in the corporate sort of finance world. I look at innovation and future tech and all that kind of stuff. But then I've worked a lot with Christian Vision, writing some content, doing some things around big questions. I work a lot with local church as well to kind of bring that to life, do like videos, run groups, that kind of thing.
Well, it'd be great to hear, Becci, just a little bit about what brought you to thinking about big questions of life. Like, why are they important to you? How have questions played a role in your own kind of belief formation?
I guess to give you like the whole story, I always grew up as a Christian, and my parents are really strong Christians, have like a really lovely Christian background. But then I sort of had questions and there was sort of never any sort of answers for particularly the really difficult ones, the ones that I would get at school, like the types of things you learn about, classic things like evolution and that sort of thing. And then I sort of went away from God whilst I was at university. This is like quite a cliched story, isn't it? But I just really wasn't in faith. And then I started to sort of come back to faith. And that was really through experience. But then I started to be like, but I'm just still not 100% because I've got all these questions in my head. And I just am the type of person where I literally can't switch it off. I can't pretend that it's okay not to have an answer. And so I started studying, I started spending a lot of time kind of trying to understand these questions. And it was just so helpful. I used to find it really anxiety inducing that I couldn't even face the question because what if the answer was a bad answer? But I've really found that God is way big enough to take any question that you could throw at him. So it's been really incredible actually to ask all these questions and find that no matter what the question is, there's a really good answer out there somewhere.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. And what is particularly interesting is obviously you took your own questions that you had and then you actually started running big question events in churches. Can you say a little bit about we've heard why personally those questions were important to you, asking questions, but how did you go about doing that? So if anyone is listening to this and thinking, oh, that's interesting, perhaps I could do this, how do you even go about sort of starting that kind of forum for people asking questions?
Honestly, it was kind of like an accident, but I started looking into all of these questions. I wanted to know all these different answers, like, did Jesus really exist? What about like evolution and Genesis? Like, why is there suffering in the world? You know, all of these kinds of things. And then I thought, no one's in like my church, like really talking about these specifically. And although there are lots of apologists, you know, in the world, there isn't actually, I don't think, as many like in local churches, people asking these kind of questions. And so I just went to one of the pastors and I was like, I think we could just make like just a house group, like just we started doing it in our house, invited people if they were interested, and then it just became like bigger and bigger. So then we started doing different types of groups with different types of people. We started doing like a video series, and just very locally, people have started to almost know that I do that. So then they just ask me questions. Like people will just stop me, especially at church, and be like, I've got this really hard question, can you? Or people point other people in my direction. So it's sort of just snowballed, I guess. But it's quite simple to set up like a small group just to start asking those questions together.
Well, yeah, just on that, I mean, do you have any like top tips as to how you could go about starting a group like that, or any things in particular that we should perhaps avoid as you do it?
I definitely think it's to avoid ending up being really like, this is the one answer to this question, because I think the whole point of it is, if you're setting up a group like this, is to be able to have that sort of discussion and to be able to talk about, these are all the different perspectives all of us have, these are different things that you could sort of read, or I always try to make it so that there's things you could read, watch, or listen to, so that if you don't like reading, there's like YouTube links or podcasts, and then you almost say, let's just have a discussion about this and think about what all the possible answers to this question are, and particularly why, almost even with all these different sorts of answers, they're all pointing towards God, which is the main thing, I guess, to remember. But I think other than that, it's just really to keep it relaxed. Like we would just do it as you would any other home group, and that's how we've continued to do it. I literally did it at youth, like just this Friday just gone, and it was the same, really, just to make sure that people felt like they could be heard and they could discuss. That's always how I would prefer to do it.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, as I think actually one of the churches I used to go to did a similar thing. And I remember thinking, actually being interested at how different people's takes were on certain subjects, even within a church that I thought where people were quite similar. I'd be interested to know what sorts of questions were people asking, or are you saying it's just very, very different from group to group or person to person?
It is different from group to group. At youth last week, bear in mind they're all under 18, someone was asking me about Constantine, and I was like, okay, this is an interesting, I'm going to have to take this one away. But I think one that comes up really often is, why is there suffering? That's probably the most common one. If God is good, why is there suffering? But also Genesis and evolution comes up a lot of times, and then there are other ones that people are really interested in, but they're maybe not so like deeply bothered by. So things like, what's the historical proof that Jesus exists? I find that generally Christians are sort of, they're not so vexed by that question. They're interested to know that, so that they can talk to friends. But then there are those questions like suffering and evolution. Those are more like things that people get quite emotional about as well.
I mean, that's a lovely broad range of questions to be asked. How do you, if you don't mind me asking, Becci, how do you, and this is something I think about for myself as well, and I would love to hear your wisdom, like how do you remain sharp and rooted in God's word as you engage with all of these kinds of questions? Like how do you stay on top of them, I guess, is what I'm wondering.
Yeah, it's taken a really long time to build up like the question set. And I've got just like pages and pages and pages of notes and links to different things. And it took a really long time for almost me to work through them. But then I've also gone through a process of, so I did my master's in theology in like my free time, whilst I was also working. And I've then had to go through a process of like linking together the real like intellectual theology side of things with like the experiential side of faith and just being on fire for God and just reading the Bible just for reading the Bible rather than really trying to like obsessively understand every single thing. Like, and I think I've found some balance with that now, but I think you do just have to make sure you're not getting too over intellectual and not really connecting to like just that relationship with God. I think you really have to keep that balanced.
Thank you for listening to the PEP Talk podcast. We hope you're enjoying today's episode. Did you know that as well as talking about evangelism on PEP Talk, the Solus team also does a lot of evangelism? Our speakers are at work every week in cafes, restaurants, pubs, and other places like university campuses sharing the gospel. If your church would like a speaker to come and help you to share the gospel with your community, get in touch with us through the Solus website. And now, back to the program.
One thing you mentioned is you've studied the Old Testament in depth, and I suppose that can be a subject that can be quite difficult to introduce to people, particularly in a day where people know less and less about the Bible. I wondered if you had any tips for if someone has questions about the Old Testament. We actually just last week had someone emailing in saying, I'm starting a group with new believers, but they're actually struggling with parts of the Old Testament, particularly the violence in the Old Testament. So I suppose I wondered what you would say in terms of how do you introduce the Old Testament specifically to non-believers? Do you have any top tips there?
Yeah. I did Genesis a few times, so the flood and the creation story in my master's. I also did some of the passages from Judges, which I think people would say are like some of the most difficult passages. And a couple of things. One is, I think it's really good to look at like what else was happening in the region at the time. Because then you get a sense of how much Israel was set apart in a really positive way. So for us, it looks like really bad because we live in the modern West. But actually, like the comparison is incredible as to how different God is from how the gods are depicted elsewhere. For example, I would highly recommend John Walton as someone to read for that. Really like quite easy to read, quite accessible. But also like things like Bible Project, which are really accessible, just small videos and stuff that really help. But then also just trying to understand what the actual passage is saying, what type of literature it is, which sounds, I think, more complicated than it actually is. Like, we all have Google. I always think as long as you are sort of generally checking your sources. So if you Google something and you sort of just like explain this to me, like why is this Judges passage really difficult? As long as you're sort of checking what those sources are and whether they would generally line up with other things you believe, I think then you can sort of avoid some of that like confusion and you can access information so easily. I also would recommend Phyllis Tribble does a book called Texts of Terror, which is a really good read if you're like really struggling with those particularly difficult passages. That's a good read as well.
This is great. Thank you so much, Becci. I guess this kind of takes us a little bit into thinking about how you go about presenting answers to questions, in that you've wonderfully just highlighted a range of sources for people who want to think more about it. But in like the small group kind of context with a few people who are asking some of the questions that you mentioned earlier, how do you go about communicating the person of Jesus or the Christian message, to people?
So I think the main thing that I would do is try to make sure that everyone can discuss, that we're not actually answering the question. I would barely ever seek to sort of like specifically answer the question. If it's something quite straightforward, like, did Jesus exist? Well, yes, Jesus did exist. There's super obvious evidence, and sort of everyone agrees that. Most atheists, scholars would say the same thing. So in instances like that, but where there are like totally valid Christian views that are in lots of different spaces, like Genesis, I would say, or like where there's not any kind of easy answer, like why is there suffering? It would always be based around discussion and letting people bring their own, like what they know, what they've experienced, their understanding of the Bible and things they've read, and then just allowing the discussion to flow. We usually do give like some information, like, so these are some different things you could think about. And then usually I follow it up with these like almost like pages that I do that have like, these are things you can read, these are things you can watch, and these are things you can listen to, that I sort of just gather together, so that if people want to refer back or they want to like look into it more, then they can do that in their own time, sort of thing.
Great. And have people come to faith through this? I was wondering if you could share any stories of if you've done this with many different groups. What are the results that you've seen? And I'm sure there was all kinds of different people along the way. So I wondered if you could share a little bit about that. Yeah.
So one in particular that I like really love. So me and my husband were at church once, and one of the pastors was like, there's this guy, he really is, he's scientist, like engineer, he's got some really like questions, big questions that he wants to know the answer to. He's kind of interested in knowing more about God, but like he can't get past these. So we literally just sat with him just in a few armchairs for ages and just talked about like his questions, particularly for him, because he's an engineer, things like evolution and that kind of thing. And he just really was like, oh, okay. So I actually think that I could like, this is something that doesn't like almost go against my like logic and the way that I think and all the science that I know. And so then he went on Alpha and became Christian. His family come to church, been coming for a few years now. We really love them, really close with them. I just built a really good relationship from that. And I think that was like exactly the kind of thing where if someone's in that space where they just can't quite like get over those questions, it's a really good thing to be able to do.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to have had you with us. Can you let us know where can we find some of these resources you mentioned, and anything more if people are interested in seeing some of the ways in which you've helped people think about the big questions?
So I can send a link to the video series, which you can link below the podcast. And then you can find some really good resources on Christian vision, etc. Or you can find me on Instagram. I can send you the handle as well. I have one for more like the theology questions. So you can put that below the podcast too.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being with us, Becci. It's really great actually to hear you encourage people just to sort of not only study the Bible in more depth, but actually just keep asking those questions. And what I particularly liked is, of course, you're not in full-time ministry and you're doing quite a lot of ministry in your own time, and it shows you actually what all of us can do actually, and starting a group like this is something that we can all do in our groups. And as you say, it's actually led to many more exciting things. We had John Lennox speaking to us recently, and he encouraged us just to keep asking questions. So it fits in with that. He said it actually as a way of sharing your faith, just keep asking those questions until they ask you a question back, and then hopefully opening up those conversations. So thank you everyone for listening. Do tune in again in a couple of weeks for another inspiring guest on the PEP Talk podcast. And it's bye from us for now. Thank you for listening.